The following content is provided under a Creative Commons license. Your support will help MIT OpenCourseware continue to offer high-quality educational resources for free. To make a donation or to view additional materials from hundreds of MIT courses, visit MIT OpenCourseware at ocw.mit.edu.
But let me mention again the tremendous importance for your understanding of the subject matter of the course, of your watching as much television as possible. Not only the new primetime schedule that's about to start next week, watch as much of it as you can make time for, and we'll single out certain programs that I hope everyone will watch, so we'll have some shared experience of contemporary television that will create a kind of ballast for our argument and complicate our argument and allow us to draw on some common examples. But even more important than that are the reruns that are on during the day on many channels and are especially available on Nick at Night and TV Land. And those of you who have access to cable systems should really watch those programs. They constitute over the course of a week or so a kind of mini history of the medium. And we're going to be trying to construct a history of the medium that takes account of the external, the political, social forces that are shaping the medium, but also take account of what we might call the internal dynamic, whereby a media system, once it is stabilized in a society, elaborates itself and evolves in certain ways that I hope I can dramatize in a very credible and useful way for you. As I suggested a few times in earlier classes, one advantage of the perspective I try to suggest in this course is that it isn't limited to television, that the framework, theoretically, I believe, the framework could be used for virtually any media system. You have to be flexible and apply it in a flexible way. But there's a process of what we might, in a broad sense, called self-discovery, wherein the new medium adapts to the particular economic and technical and environmental constraints that it faces, and also begins to explore the features and aspects of its nature that are unique to it, what distinguishes it from its ancestors. This exploration is always partial and incomplete. A most dramatic example of that in the terms of the television medium is, in some ways, the most powerful and distinctive feature of television as a medium is a feature that was barely exploited by its fiction programming, and really hasn't been much exploited by television, by the medium more generally, except in moments of crisis. And that is its power to connect people all over the globe simultaneously to an event that's taking place now. Its power of simultaneous transmission. In fact, it's a very powerful and unique feature of television. No prior technology. Radio, in some sense, was capable of doing this, but without pictures, right? But that feature of television was really not very much exploited. It's certainly not exploited at all in the fiction programming that developed, which took place, programs were filmed, and did not even attempt to exploit this. I'm not sure that that it's a feature that is likely to be of permanent and extensive use to fiction anyway, to narrative. But it's certainly a feature of television that in small ways is exploited. And of course, we can feel the power of that aspect, the power of that aspect of the medium very strongly right now, because of those images that we were able to see of things going on in New York while it was happening. But of course, that's not its only power, and its power to repeat and show things again and again is also an extraordinary aspect of what it's. And its power both to record and preserve events, and also to register events as they are happening. No medium has such a simultaneous power to do both at the same time, and one can feel that the extraordinary importance and extensive of those defining features of the medium in what we've been watching on television over the past week and more. It's a reminder of what a uniquely significant and uniquely defining instrument television is for the modern age, for the 20th and the 21st century. It's probably the distinctive technology of certainly the distinctive technology of the second half of the 20th century, and continues to be will continue to be a dominant technology in the new century. So to come back to my original idea, the framework that I'm proposing in the course about the way television in the United States evolved and developed is a framework for, I hope, is a framework with applications to other media histories. And the truth is, I think, in fact, that the basic framework is probably useful even for such recent technologies as the computer, although it's much harder to see the various phases through which computing, the computer as an object is likely to evolve. It's clear that in certain broad ways, the development of the computer resembles the way it's deployed in society and the way it has been used by the culture, resembles in certain respects the development of earlier media. And it's very useful to know that. And just as the development of television in certain fundamental ways resembles the evolution and development of American movies, which in turn mirror, although in a less decisively exact way, the process whereby earlier technologies such as the printing press were absorbed into society and used by society. So the broad perspectives, I think, are useful beyond the question of television, but I hope, in addition, that you'll come away from the course with a much more systematic and nuanced, structured, thick description of what American television is and has been, and especially what it has been. So today is our last day without clips, but you might be thinking about some of the clips that you saw on Wednesday night to complicate the things I'm going to say. One last thing about, you notice I said I made the Wasteland mythology a plural now to remind you of the fact that there are a series of mythologies. The astonishing thing is how powerful they remain even in an era when television is undergoing this transmogrification and is altering its relation to the society in such dramatic ways. But it struck me that there was one further thing to remind you about. The basic term wasteland, of course, as I've already mentioned, comes from a famous speech made by the newly appointed, John Kennedy's newly appointed head of the Federal Communications Commission to a gathering of broadcasters who expected the usual pablum from a government official, and instead received this violent attack from this young new frontiersman, and it was an attack in which he called television a vast wasteland. If we look back at the television of the early 60s, the television of 1961 when he was speaking, I think we could now in retrospect see that it was a very unfair and foolish description, that there were many banal and foolish things on television, but television was already a very complex instrument of popular culture and was doing a multitude of functions. One of the things that's wrong with the Wasteland mythology broadly is that people continue to generalize about the medium as if it's a single thing, when of course it performs so many different and fundamentally distinctive functions in the society that it's necessary to distinguish it. Nobody would generalize about the book the way people generalize about television. I mean, there are all kinds of books. There are how-to books and pornographic books and wonderful novels and great and works of history. No one would say the book is a single thing and would generalize say the book is utterly contemptible. Look at this horrible piece of pornography, right? The technology is evil. The medium is beneath contempt because Jerry Falwell publishes this book. Right? No. Even if you have contempt for Jerry Falwell's book, it doesn't mean that all books fall into. It's such an obvious thing to say, and yet people continue to talk about television as if it's this monolith. It was never a monolith. It always provided news and variety programs and daytime serials and interviews and various other forms of primetime fiction. So even from the start, it was a multitudinous medium, and to generalize. So that's another objection to what we'll call the Wasteland mythology. The way it reduces television to a monolithic experience, which is true for no human being. I mean, no person who watches television experiences it monolithically. And that doesn't even take account of the fantastic variation and variety that one might acknowledge within particular single categories of programming. I mean, just to generalize in a persuasive way about the news broadcasting and narrowcasting that's going on television today is an immensely complicated job because there's so many kinds of news broadcasts. Yes?
I was just thinking of the irony because that same communications manager probably helped utilize television to completely sculpt and promote Kennedy's image. I mean, Kennedy was so good on television.
Yes, that's
and
right.
it was really an important part of
Yes,
his legacy.
that is an interesting irony, and I think that's right. I mean, Kennedy was in some respects was the first television president and utilized television in a way that none of his predecessors had done. There are even arguments to the effect that the debates he had with Nixon, which were televised debates, were the secret to were the reason he was elected. That he was better on television. That he looked more persuasive on television. He was better at sound bites than his opponent was. And so I think that's a helpful and complicating point. One final point about the Wasteland mythology. There's another kind of resonance that the term wasteland has. And some of you with literary backgrounds will pick up on it immediately. And I think it partly explains why the metaphor was so powerful, especially among the educated classes. The defining and in many ways ridiculously simplifying poem of the 20th century in the English language is a poem by T.S. Eliot titled The Wasteland, published in 1922. It purported to describe the debased and destructive conditions of modern life, a world that was, in Eliot's view, an horrific moral and spiritual wasteland, a place of despair and emptiness and human negativity. In its day, it was unquestionably the most influential and important poem in the English language, and for several generations, it was taken to be the definitive description of modern life, of life in the mass democracies, of modern life after the death of religious observance. And it's only in relatively recent times, over the past quarter of a century and a bit more, that the poem has been recognized for the much more personal and in many ways not just eccentric, but perhaps neurotic expression that in fact it was. And there are many other texts, including Joyce's great novel Ulysses, which define and encompass modern experience, 20th century experience, in much more complex and unsimplified ways. But the cachet that the term has, the feeling that the term the wasteland would have implicitly had for many educated people, also explains, I think, something of the power of the metaphor in its use as a descriptor for what became the dominant medium of communication in the country. Susanna.
There's something that's been haunting me, I guess, about the discussion of this wasteland metaphor, and if this point doesn't seem a good one to discuss now, then perhaps we can come back to it later, but I hope we can take it up again. We've been discussing this metaphor as if it were solely imposed on, as a description of the medium and everyone who watches it, by politicians, perhaps by academics and intellectuals. On the other hand, people seem to have a very complicated relationship with television, and as we can pick up by reading some of the essays we've been reading, for example, the Paul Klein essay begins by quoting people who say that it's the self-loathing that people express when they watch TV, which they did at that time, I see, and which they certainly do now. I suppose one way of looking at it is by saying that people only pretend to be disturbed by their own relationship with television, or that we've been brainwashed into thinking that we're addicted to it and not really interacting with it in a stimulating sense. But I do know that many people seem to find television addicting, seem to say, I get up after a couple of hours and I don't feel that I've used my time well. And I know that my own relationship to TV is very, very complicated. We haven't really discussed this question, whether that's solely a function of something which we've all been told, or whether on a personal level people also have this ambivalent relationship to TV, in which case maybe there is some value in our suspicions of it.
Well, I think there's certain. I mean, look, I haven't meant to suggest that there aren't all kinds of reasons to be incredibly suspicious of television. I mean, I think television promulgates all kinds of attitudes and views that are dubious and questionable. I also think, of course, it's the case that particular viewers can use television in ways that are not healthy for them. You're certainly right. I think that many people experience the medium in a way that encourages their own that encourages them to feel negative toward it. Although it's a complicated and ambivalent relation, as you suggest, because they often are also yielding to the medium in a certain way, or allowing themselves to veg out, as they often say when they look at the medium. But I think your central point is very important, and I haven't meant to imply that I disagree with it. In fact, I think it's absolutely right. One of the reasons for the power of the Wasteland mythology is that it was so widely accepted by people who engaged in a kind of cognitive dissonance in their own attitudes toward the medium. They would, on the one hand, actually watch television all the time and get a lot out of it and actually enjoy it, but on the other hand, they would also feel that it was dangerous and bad. Some of that was a form of condescension in which people would, in some sense, exempt themselves from the dire effects that they felt were likely to be visited on others. And there is a kind of class warfare dimension to certain aspects of the way the mythology has been deployed in the past. For example, in which there's a large discourse about the danger of television to children, and a good deal of that is specifically devoted to children, to latchkey kids, right? To ghetto children, to children whose parents have to work. So if the children come home and television's the only babysitter, and the people who make these arguments, of course, are in effect exempting their own families and their own children from the baleful effects of a medium that they think is going to harm others. So that's also an aspect of the case. But I'm in a way, that's not exactly what you were saying, Susanna, and I agree with what you're saying. It seems to me that one reason for the power of the Wasteland mythology is that at some level, many people in their experience of television have the mythology ratified. They see a tremendous amount of banal programming. They see incredible foolishness and silliness on the medium. And they even see that there's a certain sense in which they can sort of just relax in front of it and allow the words and images to pour over them in a way that's very relaxing and mind-numbing. And they draw from that the conclusion that the arguments against television, and especially against its narcotizing effects, have some power. I think it is true that people can allow themselves to fall into such a relation to the medium, but there's no evidence to suggest that, in fact, those are features that are unique to television. There are other not exactly narcotizing experiences. There are other experiences in our lives that can cause us to sort of veg out or fall half asleep. And it's not intrinsic in the medium, because of course you can also interact with television in much more alert and complex ways. One might actually turn the argument on its head if one wanted to and say that one of the most remarkable things about the medium is that it allows this level of semi-conscious interaction with it, as well as allowing a much more complex, active kind of relation to the medium. The only place that I would hesitate, the only area in which I would dissent from the implications of your remarks, Susanna, is here. And although you didn't actually say this, so I shouldn't attribute this view to you, is the notion that there are negative long-term effects from this kind of vegging out. There's no real evidence for that, even though it is taken for granted that by the Wastelanders that there are negative effects from it. And even the metaphor of addiction seems inappropriate because it is not, in fact, a chemical addiction. It is not the equivalent of tobacco addiction, which we know actually affects the chemistry of the body, or heroin addiction, which again is a biological experience in a way that does not seem to be true. And people go cold turkey off television all the time without any apparent negative consequences. One more comment, and we'll move on.
I don't plan to pursue this much further. I just wanted to complicate that a little by mentioning that there are one kind of addiction currently under debate, for example, is the question of whether gambling is an addiction for some people. I just wanted to complicate the point by noting that addiction is, obviously not always used in the purely physical sense. And I think that presumably it must be what people have in mind when they talk about television addiction.
Okay. I mean, I think those are very dubious extensions of the notion of addiction.
They're under debate.
Just as we're in the current moment that we're in the United States now, there are very dubious extensions of notions of therapy to and trauma. The idea of trauma is now being extended much more widely and broadly than is probably medically or biologically accurate, and it may not be an entirely helpful extension. In the case of these definitions, I mean, look, there are people who say that there are people who extend the notion of addiction to people to sexual behavior, and people say, oh, I have to confess I'm an adulterer because I'm a sex addict. And one can easily see that in that instance of why the notion of it's very dangerous, I think, to extend the notion of addiction to non-biological base, to notions of their preferences that people have trouble breaking. That's a very different kind of thing. I acknowledge you're right that it is part of the discourse of the society, but I think it's a discourse that we might want to look on very skeptically. But let me continue here, because I don't want to keep doing this wind-up and not actually get to the core of the course, which is the reading of programs in some kind of a systematic way. The next step we make in the argument is to say, okay, if the Wasteland mythology, these various simplified ways of understanding television are inadequate, what would be an adequate way? And what I've suggested to you is, of course, is not that we suddenly begin to tell some kind of a noble or triumphal story about the medium at all, but we simply acknowledge that it is a cultural formation, that a cultural formation which has ancestors, and that we can learn something about the development of this new medium or what was once a new medium, by looking at its ancestors and by looking at the development of other media, by recognizing that certain kinds of historical comparisons might be illuminating, even granting the notion that the medium itself might have a history that is valuable. One aspect of the Wasteland mythology that I think is still the case, is that people talk about television as if it is unchanged over its 50-year history. They make or virtually so. They will sometimes talk about an alleged golden age of live television, after which everything is terrible. But for the most part, they talk about television as if it did not itself have phases, and as if the programs of the 90s are identical to the programs of the 50s. One can see the same mistake even more dramatically being made by the film scholars and the film historians, who really, many of whom, continue to speak about the movies as if they are a continuous experience from the silent era to the present day, when there are at least two decisive moments in which the movies fundamentally alter their relation to the society. One is at the advent of sound at the end of the 20s, and the other, even more dramatic, a fundamental transformation in the relationship between movies and American society, occurs with the advent of television. And by the late 50s or early 60s, the relationship between the movie industry, insofar as it's still an industry, and the public is totally different from what it was. And the movie industry, as we had understood it before, no longer exists. There are no longer vast movie studios employing hundreds and sometimes thousands of people mass producing stories on a regular basis. That movie industry is gone. That idea of the movies is finished. And each individual film becomes not only a blockbuster experience, but the creation of the film, the putting together of the film, becomes a vast, elaborate problem in deal making, in which you go and get a star who's bankable, and you go to money backers who will have, in which the production companies are simply in effect bankers. They no longer make a kind of creative contribution to the movie, and the movies are a fundamentally different artifact. They're made differently. They have their audience has a different demographic. Their relation to the society is different, and it is actually an intellectual mistake of a very large sort to pretend that the movies of the 1980s or 1990s are the same kind of object in cultural terms that the movies of the 30s or the 40s were. And so this sort of lack of awareness of even what we might call the internal history of a particular medium especially afflicts discourse about television even to this day, although some of the readings that I've asked you to do show that there is now a nascent historical scholarship being developed about television, and some of it is very interesting. And there's an essay that I've asked you to read by a young scholar named Anderson, who writes about the relation between Hollywood and Hollywood systems and television, who's done very, very interesting work. And the excerpt from his book that I've asked you to read that's reprinted in Newcomb is about the relation between the Disney company and television. It's a very important story about the way early 50s television undergoes a kind of radical transformation once the American movie industry acknowledges the existence of television and begins to supply product to it. And so there is some historical work being done by scholars, but in general, the discourse about television in the public realm still continues to be afflicted by this ahistoricism. It's a double ahistoricism then. It's an ahistoricism about the medium's history, and an ahistoricism because it also doesn't acknowledge the medium's own relation historically to other media forms. All right. So when we acknowledge that it's a cultural formation, one of the things we're acknowledging is that it potentially has a history, that it can be compared to other media, that it has its own history that we might want to attend to. And there are a couple of ways in which we can complicate and deepen our understanding of the notion that television is a cultural form or a cultural formation. One of them is to make use of the distinction, the wonderfully helpful and in many ways still immensely fruitful, rich distinction that James Carey offers us in the essay I asked you to read for one of our classes, and I hope you've all read it. I'm not going to go through it in detail, but I want to pull one thread of it out and remind you of its importance. Remember the basic distinction that Carey offers in that essay and about the way in which the idea of communication itself can be understood. He says, especially in American culture, you can actually apply this to older societies as well. There have been two, in some degree, competing ideas of what communication is, and we have tended to fall into the mistake of imagining that only one of them is viable and useful. In fact, it distorts our understanding of many communication systems, not just television, but many systems of communication if we don't acknowledge both sides of it. The one kind of definition or framework or understanding of a communication system is to see communication under the aspect of what Carey calls a transmission or a transportation model, right? And in fact, it's and the transportation model is in a way it's a very utilitarian understanding of the movement of information and the movement of the communication of messages. You move information from one place to another, right? The telegraph is a classic instance of this process. And in this idea of in this notion of communication, communication is a commodity whose use has to. In a very narrow sense, is useful for such things as commercial transactions. So if you can, and it's valuable for that reason. And it involves the notion that the information is valuable only if it can be transmitted in some way across a geographical area. So that if you live in San Francisco and you can get information about what's going on in the stock market, you can act on that information. And if you're cut off from that information, the people in New York have an advantage over you, right? So the one notion of communication, so that the telegraph was understood incredibly, although for other reasons as well, the telegraph was understood as especially valuable for the transmission or the transportation, the movement of financial information. It's also been, and such things, of course, have been, the military institutions of all societies are interested in communications from this transportation perspective for obvious reasons. It was the quick communication of information between units or from command headquarters to people on the front is crucial for the operations of the military. One doesn't have to sort of narrow this notion of a transmission view of communication only to military and economic information. The movement in society of other more generalized forms of information is partly embodied in or captured by a transmission or a transportation model. But Carey's crucial point is that this is an essentially utilitarian and functional understanding of what the communication of messages is used for, how they function in society. And what Carey suggests is that there's another way of understanding communication, not one that's better, but one that's different, and that in fact explains aspects of the way communication systems and the experience of communication is used in all cultures that the transmission view of communication does not allow. And that's what he calls a ritual view of communication. And under the ritual understanding of communication, the purpose of communication, the social or anthropological function of communication, is not to transport information, not to give you useful information, not to tell you, not to provide you with news, not to inform you of anything, but to do something else. It's to engage. It's to help the society engage in various ritualized processes of sharing and self-definition. So that when a group, and in fact, Carey explicitly suggests that this ritual view of communication is connected, has its roots in religious experience. When you gather together in a church service, it's not as if specific information is being imparted to you, but the experience of the religious observant helps to establish and create and maintain notions of connection with your fellow communicants. It helps in a sense to create and maintain the community that comes into the cathedral or the church or the synagogue or the mosque for the religious service, right? And Carey is in many ways himself a secretly religious person. He's a good friend of mine. I've sometimes had him come to MIT and lecture, and he's been an influence on my own willingness to talk about media that in the early days when I first began to talk about them put me under a cloud in Yale's English department. Carey is himself a kind of closet religious. I mean, he's an Irish Catholic from Providence, Rhode Island. Although he's a lapsed Catholic, he has deeply religious inclinations, and I think that's one of the reasons that he's attentive to this ritual perspective. Well, we've just come through a moment in America where we're still undergoing a moment in American society where it's much easier to see this ritualized function than we might of television, as for example, than we might otherwise have done. In any case, the notion of the ritual definition or the ritual idea, the ritual framework for understanding communication systems suggests that we don't read newspapers to get information, or we don't only read newspapers to get information. We read newspapers to be connected to our fellow citizens. We read newspapers because the reading of the newspaper creates not just of one story, but the regular reading of the newspaper creates an experience wherein what the newspaper stories taken together do is provide us with a kind of broad understanding of the nature of our society. It defines the belief system or the value system of our society. And by reading the newspaper every day, we participate in a process that's ongoing. It's not a single. It's not a thing. The creation of community, societies and communities are not created and then the job is done. Communities are maintained and kept in. They are maintained and repaired. Right. Sometimes dangerous things happen. Terrible things happen to societies. Right. The World Trade Center catastrophe is the most immediate, obvious example. What do you do when that happens? What does the society do? One of the things you do is you all begin to watch television. And when we're watching television and watching the planes hitting the World Trade Center again and again and again and again, we're not getting information. What's happening there? Some kind of ritualized experience of sharing and reparation is going on, in which we're trying to, as a whole, society as a whole is trying to make sense of, right, an horrific rent in its fabric. The community has been disrupted and terrified by what's happened here. And one of the functions of all media, one of the functions of communication as a human activity, Carey says, is to repair that damage, is to ritualize the experience, is to create a sense of sharing. The social fabric is rent, and we maintain it and repair it by talking about it. And in fact, talk is a form of communication, right? And almost the greatest novel ever written, also the very first novel ever written, Don Quixote, is about the reparational powers of conversation. Again and again in that novel, Quixote rides into some difficulty, is knocked on his back, is lying bleeding on the ground, and Sancho comes over to him and says, well, and often Sancho Panza, his realistic counterpart, right, the ideal and the real riding together into the world, the material and the spiritual joined together as they ride into experience. The realistic side of the equation says, well, it's never so dark as before the dawn. And he repeats all these boring, stupid cliches. And Quixote will sometimes respond, oh, Sancho, you bore me to death with your stupid cliche. The very fact that they talk makes the bleeding from his ears less terrible, right? Conversation itself in that novel and in our lives is a form of reparation. So it's a brilliant and obviously right way of understanding what communication is. We don't read the newspapers. We don't watch NYPD Blue. We don't even watch the news on television necessarily or primarily in order to find something out, right? A transmission, a functional use of the medium. We watch it in part to share with our fellow citizens an experience that helps us in the process, in the continuous process that we engage in doing so, that helps us to repair and recreate and rehearse the nature of our society. That society itself is a continuous process of this sort of reparation and maintenance work that communication systems perform for us. The anthropological or sociological function of communication systems under the ritual view is this maintenance and reparation of the social fabric. Yes, question. Sorry I made you wait so long.
That's okay. The one thing I don't understand when I was reading it is if, like, I understand both views, but what confuses me is that the ritual model seems like just an extension of the transmission model. Like, you can't have, like, I don't know how to explain it, but even in the ritual model, if we're all sitting around watching the news simply to have a common sense, state of mind, watching the planes drop over and over again, we're still receiving that information. And like by receiving the information, it is because of the information that we are connected on the same level. So how is the ritual model significantly different than the transmission model, and how can we only look at how can one be dominant over the other?
Okay, well, I don't think it's a question of one dominating
in America,
right?
or at the very least.
They're sort of competing ways of understanding what communication is. But I think there are a couple of answers to what you're saying. One is that you're not problematizing the word information enough. What makes you think that what you're getting is actually always information? In the case of the images of the planes crashing into the tower, I suppose there is a level of information involved. But suppose we change things, and suppose we're talking about the watching of a situation comedy. The situation comedy is a fantasy. What's happening, and in fact, even the account of family life that television that you maybe get provided by is not in a narrow or objective sense a reality. It's a construction, an interpretation, right? And one could, and of course, one could argue that news itself, that what we call information, is really a kind of construction. It's one way of understanding particular details, so that the narratives that the information that we get when the planes crash into the World Trade Center isn't simply the visual image. Imagine how a member of the Hamas, right, the Palestinian organization that we in America and the Israelis label a terrorist organization. I'm being too neat. I think it is a terrorist organization. By me, it's a terrorist organization. But imagine the Hamas watching that, and imagine a commentator from the Hamas commenting on it, or imagine the Syrian newspaper that carried an editorial the day after the World Trade Center catastrophe, saying the days of American hegemony are over, and that finally America's in the twilight of its power. Okay, on the basis of the World Trade Center, so that the meaning of those planes crashing into the World Trade Center is not obvious. It depends on the constructions that are put upon those events by the narratives that surround it, and those narratives are going to differ from one kind of culture and one ideological center to another. The process of doing that, of surrounding the event with commentary, with talk, with constructions, right, of constructing the meaning of those events, is partly, and even maybe largely, a ritualizing process. And it may not really have to do with anything that we might label, in quotes, objective. I'm not sure that there is such a thing. But in other words, because one might say that there is no single meaning to such a shocking and decisive event. That the meanings of that event are non-existent until they're surrounded by varieties of interpretation, until particular, and in fact we know for sure that even the way the European press or the way the European television programs, television commentators would have responded to that is different from the way the American networks responded to it. Right? So that's part of the answer to your question. That the notion of an information of a relatively clear informational content that is communicated by the message is oversimplified. That we need to understand that the information itself is a series of constructions that also involve this ritualizing process of sharing meanings and of making meanings.
Is the transmission model Well, when you say transmitting information, is information in this case synonymous with stimuli? Because I think, I don't know.
I guess not. No, I mean it's synonymous with maybe a simple word for it would be with the message, right? Whatever. Let's think of the message isn't a simple word, is it? With the iota of data, with the data that comes through the system. In other words, even the word fact is problematic here, but in other words, imagine a radio commentator saying 2 planes apparently piloted by terrorists full of passengers crashed into the World Trade Center today. That straightforward statement of quote fact might constitute sort of the basic data. And then what happens is that data is immediately surrounded by an immense amount of commentary and communicate and interpretation. The data is constructed and made usable by a process of understanding that and interpretation that surrounds it.
All right, this is my last comment. It's just that I was thinking, all right, so forget the news, because let's say, for example, the news is the transmission of information under all intents and purposes. But what about sitcoms? Like
what
you
about
mentioned it. Sitting around watching a sitcom, and you know that millions of people around the country are also watching this sitcom, you're still receiving stimuli, but not. Actually, I have no clue what I was going to say with that.
Well, I mean, I think in a way, the notion of communication systems as ritual, as engaging in a. Remember, we're not saying that either function cancels the other, right? But the notion of communication systems as performing a ritual function is immensely helpful because it actually explains not only the fact that we surround the so-called facts with all kinds of potentially competing interpretation, but it also explains other aspects of our experience of media that don't have to do with the transmissions of news reports, right? It's precisely that. It isn't simply it isn't in the case of the situation comedy. It isn't just the single situation comedy that we're talking about necessarily. What it is, it's the process of sitting down and over generations, right, over many nights, watching these stories of families in domestic environments, interacting. So what's the effect of that? In other words, if we think about it, in other words, at the very center of the mythology of American television over the period that we're going to be interested in it, is some notion of the family, right? Families are among the decisive, recurring institutions that a variety of television genres deal with. So in a certain sense, what's going on is ideas of the family are being rehearsed, are being represented, and what's happening is that stories about family life, stories about the relation between husbands and wives, between mothers and children, between the workplace and the domestic space of the family are being repeated and enacted again and again and again in the course of the meeting. So what's one function? And it's very clear what the ritual function is once you see it over time. Right? We could dramatize it very richly. Let's do an oversimplified version of it to clarify what we're talking about here. This is why a ritual view of the medium is so helpful for non-news, non-documentary programming especially. Let's just stick very quickly to a kind of evolution of situation comedy. And suppose we went from I Love Lucy to the Dick Van Dyke Show to the Mary Tyler Moore Show, to Roseanne. Right? We could go on, but let's make one more step. What's the step? One of you wants to write about this. Sex in the City. Now, I'm oversimplifying here. Sex in the City doesn't fit perfectly well because it's not actually a perfect situation comedy. Although we could put Friends in here if you want, because something happens in the 80s and 90s. Families begin to disappear. Well, what does the? I mean, many other things are going on, and we'd have to surround this. This progression oversimplifies because there are dozens and dozens of situation comedies in each era, right? But still, let's say these are in certain ways represented. What's going on here, right? Lucy constrained in the house all the time. The basic plot of the Lucy show is Lucy wants to get out of her domestic constraints, and in the court, and the basic plot is a humiliation plot in which Lucy tries to become to get into Ricky's show, or tries to get onto a quiz show, or tries to become an entrepreneur by producing vitamins, right? And in every case, she suffers a horrific humiliation, a horrific comic humiliation at the end, right? So the notion here is that the norm is women belong in the home, and that Lucy's comic, lovable but comic desires to escape the home are just that, lovable and comic, and not to be taken seriously. But we move to the Dick Van Dyke Show. We've moved from the city to the suburbs, which is an interesting move in itself that tells us something about the family, right? But children play a slightly more important role, and there are other shows we could mention where that's more important. But the wife here is a woman who had a career before her marriage began, and there are various moments in the show where she returns to her career in certain ways that seem to threaten the fabric. By the time we get to the Mary Tyler Moore Show, what's happened? The same actress who is the mother here, and that makes it further complicates the continuity, right? And makes the argument even more explicit that the same actress who was the homebody suburban mother, frequently in the Dick Van Dyke Show, she's given an opportunity to become the dancer that she was before she was married, and she turns it down because she loves the domesticity of being a suburban housewife, right? There's an even more dramatic example of this that we'll talk about briefly when we start looking at actual programs. It's a magical show. How many of you know the show I Dream of Jeannie? Well, almost everyone. And that's a measure of how it's still how the TV is a universal show. Can you think of another magical show like that? Bewitched. Bewitched may be even a better example. But in both those cases, what's interesting about them? The women have magical powers in those shows. They're superhuman. They're not human beings. In one case, it's a witch, and Jeannie is a genie, right? They have total power. How do they choose to use their power? Totally subordinating themselves, right? The mother in Bewitched could twitch her nose and clean the house, but she prefers to use a broom and a dust mop because her hubby prefers it. Right? She could, by the twitch of a nose, travel to Paris with her mother and have a delicious meal at the fanciest Parisian restaurant, but she chooses to make pot roast for her husband who comes home from a hard day at the office, right? Think of the fantasy that the patriarchal culture is engaging in here. But still, you can think of it as this. It's comic, but it's still engaging in a kind of discourse about gender relations and about the power relations in families, right? By the time we get to the Mary Tyler Moore Show, what's happened? The woman has been liberated, right? It's a single woman. She's trying to make it on her own, right? But in an odd way, because television is always conservative, as well as because this ritualized process is complicated, and new or emergent ideas are treated very gingerly and nervously in a conservative consensus medium, which is what television was. What happens? There is a family there, isn't it? The workplace is reconstituted as a kind of family, and in fact it resembles a lot of the families of situation comedies of the past, right? So that Ted Baxter is the sort of foolish, silly, embarrassing brother figure, right? And Lou Grant is the benign father figure, right? And the workplace replaces the family, but in ways that make sort of explicit that the values that we had associated with family life are somehow still alive in this new environment. What's going on, in a certain sense, is exactly this ritualizing process in which the society is responding. And so, if we think of the discourses of situation comedy as a whole, we're not talking in an artistic or aesthetic mode now, right? We're talking in an anthropological or cultural mode. We're saying, what cultural work do television programs play? They play a ritualized role. One of the things they do is they rehearse ideas about human nature, about the role of women, about the role of families, and again, remember the idea is that the maintenance and reparation of the social fabric is not a job that's ever finished. This is why the series is such a genius format for this process, because series are theoretically endless, ongoing, right? So the idea is that the process of defining a culture, the process whereby a culture defines its nature and organizes its systems of values, is always unfinished. It's always in flux. Culture's always, right? Culture's always a conversation. I hope you see how these ideas are also embedded in my essay, Television as an Aesthetic Medium. And this flux, this uncertainty, this continuous process is recaptured in a certain way, or is enacted in part for us in various media of communication, not only in television, but in various media of communication. Every time we go to the movies, every time we turn on the radio, every time we go to the theater, every time we listen to a song, every time we engage in any kind of institutionalized behavior, some aspect of our social life is being rehearsed or reinforced or challenged, right? But there are certain media in culture that are more important than others in trying to identify, rehearse, and define what we might call the central or the defining or the consensus values of the society. And my idea is that in most societies, only one such institution is usually so designated. I don't mean that somebody says you will be the consensus medium of a society, but I do mean that by a kind of very complex cultural, sociological, anthropological, political process, a particular medium is likely to emerge as the one that is most widely shared by the most people in the society. That medium, it's not a better medium, it's just different, right? Theater in our society today is a subcultural experience. It doesn't belong to the whole population. Right? The same with wrestling. The same with opera. Right? Particular groups of people like opera and go to opera. Particular groups of people like country and Western music. Those forms of communication and are also ritualized in certain ways. Those forms of entertainment and representation are not less valuable than the consensus system I want us to study today, but they're different. And one of the fundamental ways they're different is that the consensus medium has certain features that are a function of the fact that that medium is understood by the whole society, by a kind of process of licensing and broad agreement, is understood by the whole society to address the whole society. It never really addresses the whole society. There are always groups that are excluded and not acknowledged by the consensus medium. The consensus is not an authentic consensus in which truly includes everyone, right? That's why I would always put consensus in quotation marks. It's a constructed consensus. It's a consensus. It's an imagined consensus, right? And in medieval society, the consensus medium was the Bible, and the experience of going to attending church services where the meanings in the Bible were promulgated and spread through the society, right? At a certain point, I think the theater became the consensus medium, at least of British society. The public theaters in Shakespeare's day were attended by the widest swath of the population. They appealed much less of a subculture than other forms of entertainment and communication in the society. In a later phase, I think the novel, the printing press generated a particular form of narrative, the novel, which reached much more broadly, much more widely across social classes, across gender barriers, than any prior system of narrative had done, including the theater. And the novel became, in the 19th century and in part of the 18th century, in certain European societies and in the United States, the consensus medium. The medium that, and in the 20th century, I'm suggesting to you, in the United States, the movies and then television were the consensus medium. I'll talk a bit more about this in a second. So, I've jumped ahead, but it's okay. So this notion, one of the things I've been suggesting to you then, is that culture itself is a process. Right? Culture itself is never finished. Right? This is an idea that comes especially out of the writings of Raymond Williams. And the British cultural historian and sociologist, literary scholar and sociologist. And Williams suggests in several places in his writings that one way to understand culture is to think of it literally as a kind of ongoing conversation. It's a wonderful insight to recognize that culture itself is not fixed. It's not finished. It's continually in process. And he identifies what might be called three basic strands in the conversation of culture. One strand is what might be called the residual strand, and that's the strand of the set of values and beliefs that belong to an older time, to the eras that are ending, right? We might think of certain kinds of in our own society, certain notions about rural America and about the values of small-town America as having, or certain forms of religious fundamentalism in the United States as belonging to this residual discourse. Then there's the dominant discourse, the discourse of the majority, at the very center of what the culture thinks of itself. And then, on the other side, there's what might be called emergent discourses, discourses of ideas and perspectives and value systems, value structures that are not yet fully established, but are emerging and are likely to become important. We might think, for example, of the ecology discourse today, or the animal rights discourse today as part of an emergent discourse, not yet at the center of cultural values, but I think likely to become so. Right? Certainly, the ecological argument is in your own lifetime has moved more and more toward the center. Almost, maybe it's not yet utterly at the center, but it's much closer to the center than it was 15 or 20 years ago. And there's an example of so we can think of culture as a process in which these three kinds of voices, of strains, of value systems, of beliefs, of attitudes are in a kind of constant alternating flux or conversation, and it means that they shift. What was once dominant can become residual, and what is now emergent can become part of the dominant value structure. Right? Well, the process whereby that happens is the process of communication, and it specifically happens on the consensus medium that I've been talking about, which will differ in different societies. And I think one of the interesting things about our current moment is that television still performs at least in a partial way the great central consensus role that it had played through the late 50s through the 80s sometime, although it had already been by the end of the 70s you can see the consensus system beginning to fray and break down somewhat, and that's what we're going to study, is that process whereby television becomes the consensus medium in the society, articulates what are consensus values. We can see the consensus values undergoing some radical threats and changes, and then we can see the consensus function itself beginning to break down by some time. It really begins to break down by the end of the 70s, and but it's a slow process. It doesn't happen overnight, and these historical generalizations never have the neatness of mathematical equations. So it's not the case that one could say, okay, the consensus function of television is completely gone now in 2001, but it's becoming residual. The reason that I gave out this piece from the New York Times is that this moment we've been going through is a reminder of the extent to which television still performs, especially at certain moments of cultural crisis, the old consensus function that had performed in all ways through the 60s and 70s. The kind of comfort and solace that the country got by watching Dan Rather fall into tears on the screen, a sentimental creature that he is. He went on the David Letterman show and he broke down 3 times weeping. And I'm not much taken by that, but it's maybe a part of the explanation for why Dan Rather has such an intimate connection to the audience, that they sense how deeply engaged he is by this story. But in any case, the network news programs performed a function during this crisis that was like the function they'd performed earlier when the Kennedy assassination was a dramatic example of it, but there have been others. And in those times, the consensus reparative function, the ritual function of television becomes explicit, impossible to miss. But our argument in this course is that process, that function is always implicit, and that's always one aspect of what television has been doing and continues in some partial way to do in American society. So let me say a little bit more then about what my notion of consensus narrative. And again, I'm drawing out strains that are fully defined in the essay I hope you have read and will reread closely. These consensus systems have particular qualities that are worth emphasizing, and they have 3 features in particular. They are accessible, they're conservative, and they're collaborative. Let me talk about each in turn, and I define these much more elaborately and fully in the essay. Let's start with the middle one, conservative, because it may be the most important. They're deeply conservative media, because they have to be. If they're at the center of the society, if everybody, it's not really everybody, at a certain point, the dominant consensus in American society in the 1950s did not acknowledge people of color. So the consensus, and so one of the reasons we want to look at consensus media is not because the values they articulate are necessarily ones we would embrace, but because they can also tell us how the society defines itself. They're incredibly important media for cultural historians. They also may have artistic value at a certain point, but from a historical or anthropological perspective, they are really interesting to study. They tell us more about society, the society represent and embody than the subcultural forms do. The subcultural forms reveal things about society too, but not in the same way that consensus systems do. So that's one of the great justifications for studying television closely, is that it tells us a lot. If we study it intelligently and with the proper degree of skepticism and theoretical sophistication, we can learn a great deal about the society embodied in it, mirrored in its stories. It's not a one-to-one simple mirroring, and that's why I want to put the word consensus in quotations, right? I don't mean that it's a true consensus. I don't mean everyone's voice is really there. But I mean the society pretends that everyone's voice is there. The society pretends that the values that are promulgated and taken for granted, the values that are embedded in the consensus system, are the values of the whole society. And we can recognize the limitations of those values if we look closely at those stories. Imagine what we might learn then if we went into the consensus. What would it be? Radio or some form of some combination of print media in Nazi Germany in the late 30s and 40s. What we would find is a consensus that agreed that Jews were vermin. Right? So I don't mean to suggest that I don't want to put a moral valuation on the term consensus. For our purposes, I want it to be a descriptor, right? Not a valuation, but just a descriptive, a way of describing the role that these media play in a particular culture. Okay, so let's talk about its conservative function. It has to be conservative because it has to appeal across so many boundaries, and that means that certain kinds of emergent or radical notions which would offend large proportions of the population won't work on the medium. So it's conservative in terms of its content, in terms of the belief systems and values that it will promulgate. Right? And that's why in the early 50s, the idea of the nuclear family with the husband who works and the wife who stays at home was a staple, a standard feature. And even though there was a kind of subversive energy in the comic ways in which in many of those families, the Lucy Show being a dramatic example of it, the plot seemed again and again to dramatize a kind of discontent with that arrangement. The truth of the matter is that it was comedy always depends upon what are thought to be departures from the norm, right? If the norm is violated, it seemed to be comical and funny. Right? Another kind of situation comedy from this early period is the situation comedy in which the wife is missing. We can call them, and in which the female figure is replaced, the wife and mother figure is replaced by a comical, often desexualized male figure. Can you think of shows like that? My Three Sons is a terrific example, and it ran for a long time. How many of you have seen My Three Sons? Well, a couple of you. It's available. It's an incredibly silly show in many ways. But what makes it interesting in a certain sense, it draws a lot of its comedy from the absence of the female figure. And the male figure, who often is seen in wearing aprons and cooking badly and so forth, who inadequately replaces another such show is called Bachelor Father. There are a series of them. Another one a little bit later on was called Full House. Well, that's a very late one. Yes, Full House. But see, by the time we get to Full House or My Three Dads, we're in a different cultural dispensation, and the absence of the female figure has a different cultural meaning from what it had in the 50s and early 60s. Because what's happened is the nuclear family is no longer the norm by the time we get to a show like My Three Dads. Right? So yes, Wally, put on your.
My question is actually when did the play The Odd Couple? When was it written? I don't know. I assume the play came before the show.
Yes, the play precedes the television show. I don't know the date, but late 50s, early 60s is my guess. But let me come back to this first. So what I'm saying is that in the early phase, the situation comedy with the absent female figure doesn't actually signify the notion that there's a discontent in the society with the norm of the nuclear family. It signifies the opposite. What's comical, what is a continuous source of comedy, is this failure to meet what the norms of society assume. And one thing people always laugh at are violations of what is thought to be an utter norm. In other words, it's as if the notion of the nuclear family was so naturalized, was understood so deeply to be a part of nature, to be not a construction, something that could change, but a part of the natural order of the world, not part of a particular social system, that variations from it were seen as comically unnatural. Right? And it's only later that the variations begin to take on a conscious sense that, wait a minute, this is a constructed relation, and many families are actually not organized on the nuclear family model, and maybe the nuclear family model isn't so universal and isn't so natural as we had originally thought. But that's a process. That's a process that actually, in a certain sense, could be said to be articulated or enacted. That recognition that the nuclear family is not the only way we can think about families, or that the housewife is not the only role we can think of for women. That's a process that's actually enacted in the course of the development of particular genres on television. So that what I'm saying in a certain sense is that the conservative features of consensus media of a consensus medium are particularly important, because when we see that belief structure changing in certain ways, certain basic assumptions that the medium might be making about essential features of the society, we can say that those changes are really signify in a way that would not be true if we were looking at a medium that was defined only by a particular narrow subculture of society. It signifies much less if the avant-garde novel doesn't respect the nuclear family than it does if the television system is beginning to say, wait a minute, I can imagine families where the woman is dominant. I can imagine families in which there is no father. I can imagine families in which the children are smarter than the adults, which is one of the things that begins to, in a disturbing way, happen at a certain point in the history of family sitcoms. Right? So a consensus system is conservative in content, but it's also conservative in format. That is to say, the basic it will not engage in what we might think of as modernist or avant-garde or narrative strategies. It's aesthetically conservative. Right? Formally conservative, as well as conservative in content, as well as conservative in ideology, for exactly the same reason. And that's why it signifies very greatly that at a certain point in the late 70s or early 80s, we begin to get television shows that use complex flashback structures that make it much more difficult to follow the narrative. Instead of having a straightforward narrative which is organized chronologically, you begin to get television programs in which the chronology is disrupted in the way that the modern novel did at the turn of the century. Right? But when television narrative begins to show modernist tendencies, it suggests something, among other things, about the breakdown of the consensus function that television had been performing in American society. So it's conservative ideologically and conservative formally or aesthetically. It's accessible, that is to say, it speaks, and this is an aspect of its conservatism, it's accessible because to be a consensus medium, it has to speak broadly to everyone. It has to use a common, a shared language. It will embody, it will talk and utilize the myths and stories that are at the heart of the culture, and it will communicate them and rehearse them again and again. And finally, it's a collaborative medium. In the deepest possible sense, it's collaborative first, in the case of movies or theater or television, because many people collaborate to make the text. There's no single author, right? No television program or movie actually has a single author. The author is a writer, a director, the actors. There's that kind of collaboration involved. But that's the smallest aspect of the collaboration. What else does it collaborate with? The system also the story also collaborates with the understanding that the audience has of this material. The audience is an active collaborator. The audience's prior understanding of the generic forms that they're watching. The audience's prior understanding of the characters inside the story is a part of the collaboration. But even more deeply than that, there's a notion that the larger wisdom or wisdom system of the culture, the larger story systems and myth systems of the culture are also lie behind and help to explain the content of consensus narrative. So that if there are traditional notions of individualism that have organized American society since the Revolutionary War, those notions of individualism are going to feed into and help to shape the stories that are told on the system's consensus medium. So the texts on a consensus medium collaborate not only with their own immediate ancestor texts, but also with the older ancestor media and ancestor stories that are the shared possession of the culture as a whole. So in that sense, consensus medium is a deeply collaborative system. I try to embody this idea in that passage in which I conclude the essay on television as an aesthetic medium, in which I talk about that astonishing, wonderful moment in Shakespeare from Cymbeline, when standing over a dead body, they sing this magnificent dirge to a person who appears to be dead. It's one of the great elegies in English literature. And the crucial lines are, golden lads and girls all must, as chimney sweepers, come to dust. And they are beautiful and magnificent lines, aren't they? And they are consoling lines in a certain way. The lines take on a kind of richness and resonance when we recognize that the term in Shakespeare's native Warwickshire, the term golden lads refers literally to the flower we call the dandelion, which has a golden cap when it's young and strong, and then when it ages, when it goes to seed, that cap turns into those. They're very common here in New England, right? Turns into a kind of set of white filaments, and kids pick them, and if they blow on them, the seeds can be blown away, right? Well, so they're golden lads when they're young, and why are they called chimney sweepers? Because chimney sweepers' brooms in Shakespeare's day looked like those flowers when they've gone to seed, and were actually they had a rounded top like that, and it was easier to clean chimneys with such a rounded brush. So they called dandelions golden lads when they were young, and chimney sweepers when they were close to death. Well, why is that so wonderful? Two reasons. It gives a kind of poetic resonance to the line because it links human death with the cycle of the seasons. Golden lads and girls all must, as chimney sweepers, come to dust. The rich and the poor, the highborn and the low, all die. We share that with each other. Not just that, we share that with nature, with the natural process. So it's a brilliant line. But the most important thing for me is how deeply collaborative it is, because Shakespeare didn't invent the metaphor. What grants the authority to the line is the common wisdom of the Elizabethan culture in which Shakespeare was born, and the culture behind that, because it was the native farmers in Warwickshire who never read blank verse in their lives who came to call the dandelions golden lads and chimney sweepers. So what Shakespeare is doing there, in a way, is he's collaborating with his culture. He's seizing on what we might call the common wisdom of his culture in order to express an immensely complex, rich idea, which in part belongs to the culture. Well, that's a very dramatic and poetic instance of this principle of collaboration that I think is operative on our popular media all the time. And we are going to have occasions as we go on in this course to see instances of such collaboration and of such self-consciousness in our popular television programs that I think are at least the equal of the subtlety of those wonderful Shakespearean lines. We're finished. See you next time.